we've been trying to answer the question over the last couple of weeks, is it possible for two people to fall in love and then just stay in love? And we're going to look at some verses today that apply not just to marriages, but really apply to every relationship. We're going to talk about your friendship relationships for a moment. I think parental relationships. We want to make this really a relatable message to everybody that is here, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're divorced, come from a blended family. It really doesn't matter. We just love you, whoever you are. So is it possible for two people to fall in love and stay in love? And I think all of us want to believe that. We want to believe that. We want to have that special love in our life, that person in our life that's always going to be there. And I think that desire to have that exclusive relationship, I think, is the fingerprint of God, who wants an exclusive relationship with you because he just loves you that much. And so we kind of started out, let me recap for where we were the last couple of weeks. I made some people really uncomfortable with this statement as we opened up the whole series. We need to make love. Say it with me. We need to make love a verb. There you go, with me, okay? And then we talked the second week about mutual submission, that in a good marriage or a good relationship, there's no room for competition, Last week we talked about the things that are inside of our heart. We need to monitor the things of our heart. We like to monitor other people's behavior, but we need to monitor our heart, because sometimes in a marriage relationship, or any relationship for that matter, we get bumped. There's a little bit of a disagreement, and the stuff that just comes spewing out of us is the stuff that has been in our heart. It's the junk that's always been there, but it doesn't come out a lot of times until we get married. And so here's what I thought about this. As I kind of recap everything over the last 3 weeks, I thought, if you had been here for the last 3 weeks of this series, or maybe just 1 or 2 weeks of the whole thing, how many are pretty convinced that everything you heard in the series doesn't apply to you, but it definitely applies to your spouse? Anybody with me on that? Okay, I thought about that. I'm pretty sure that that's the way that whole thing goes. But today, I want to share with you some stuff that we need to apply to every relationship. Not just marriage relationships, but this can apply to every relationship. And here's what I want to ask you this morning. You need to think about these two questions when you think of every relationship, be it with your parents, with your siblings, with your spouse, with your children. It doesn't matter, every relationship. And here's the questions you need to ask. When I think of this relationship, do I want to believe the best, or do I want to assume the worst? Do I want to believe the best in them? Do I want to lavish grace upon them? Do I want to give them the benefit of the doubt? Do I always want to believe the best in that person? Or am I the pessimist, as we talked about a little bit last week? And you know what? They just always fail me. They always let me down. They always do this. They never do that. And so we then assume the worst in them. Now, we're going to get really practical for a few moments from a Bible passage you might be familiar with. A guy named Paul writes this to a church in the city of Corinth. If you brought a Bible, you want to turn there with me. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 for a little bit. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, a lot of times people call this the love chapter. And if you go to Bible camp, you've probably read these verses to that special someone on Thursday night, the night before you all go back home again. And this is all about love. And if you've been in the church for a while, you're familiar with these verses. Maybe you had these verses read at your wedding. But we're going to camp out for a little bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And we're going to start with verse number 4. And this stuff just is common sense. So let's start in verse number 4 and see what it says here. Look at verse number 4. Love, we're talking about love now. Paul says, love is patient and kind. You know what? Love, when you love somebody, you're just nice to them. It's patient, you're kind. And you know what? If you want to, you can take the word love out of there and put your name in there if you want to. Chris is patient and kind. Why are you laughing? Because he's not, right? Okay, so anyway, he says, love is patient and kind. Not only that, love is not jealous. It's not jealous. In other words, love is not an insecure person. Love isn't possessive of somebody else. Love doesn't try to squeeze somebody in their hand, just trying to control them. Love holds people in the open hand because love is trusting that way. Love is not boastful or proud or rude. He says in verse number 5, love doesn't demand its own way, and it's not irritable, and it keeps no record of wrong. Again, you could insert a name in there. You could say Doris. Doris doesn't demand her own way. Doris isn't irritable, and Doris keeps no record of wrong. Well, the Bible's wrong there because Doris, she knows everything. It was April 3rd, 1974, and we've got the historical record, right? But Paul says here, no, love doesn't do that. It's just practical stuff. Verse number 6, love doesn't rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. We're happy for the other person. When they succeed and do well, we're just happy for them. We're not jealous for them. And then the next verse is probably the most difficult verse for us. This is when I read this is where I take issue with this. People come in and talk to me about the struggles they're having in their marriage. I've heard the gamut of things that have happened in the marriage. I've heard about the affairs. I've heard about all kinds of stuff when people come and talk to me. And I myself read the next verse and go, I don't know, Paul, if I can agree with you with verse number 7. And you might even struggle a little bit with verse number 7, especially in a marriage context. Because look what he says in verse number 7. Look, this is huge now. He says this, love never gives up. Love never loses faith. Love is always hopeful. In fact, it endures through every circumstance. Now, you could pause right there and say, how long is never? Never is how long? Say it with me. Forever, right? So forever, love will believe the best in the other person. Really? Love never gives up. Love never loses faith. Yeah, but Pastor, you haven't been in my home. You don't know what I've had to endure. You don't know what he said. You don't know what she said. You don't know who they were with. You don't know who they had the affair. You don't know the circumstances. So you want me to adopt this verse into the way I look at my relationships, especially in marriage. Pastor, if you only knew, Pastor, you would have given up a long, long time ago. I'll give you a sermon to talk about, Pastor. You come be married to the person living in my house. Never gives up, never loses faith, endures through every circumstance. Really, Pastor? An affair? Abuse? Now, I'm not saying we don't have a conversation sometimes in our marriages, but I'm saying we have to start somewhere with either believing the best or always assuming the worst. In every relationship, now I want to tell you something about every relationship. This is every relationship, just not marriage relationships. There is an expectation in the relationship, especially in marriage, though, that when you were standing at the altar and you were taking the vows and you were about to begin this whole life together, whether you said it or not, there were expectations. And unfortunately, we don't communicate those expectations before we get married. We just assume they know our expectations. And now we're married, we're sharing a life together, there's a roof over our head, and suddenly they're not meeting our expectations. And so between expectations and reality, the reality is you're not meeting my expectations. There's a huge gap. And we get to choose what we put in the gap. The expectation is, you said you'd be home on time. You said you'd be here at supper time. You said that you would never do that again. You said you wouldn't drink anymore. You said that you'd stop texting that person. When we were at the altar, you promised that you would love and cherish me. When we were dating, you made this promise that you'd give up this disgusting habit. And you said that you were going to call. And you said you'd stop at the store. And you said you'd pick them up. And you said that you'd have that conversation. That's the expectation. You said. The reality is you haven't done any of that. And so now there's a gap, and we get to choose what goes on inside of that gap. I'm visual, so let me illustrate it this way in a slide. It looks a little bit like this. Here's a slide. There's expectation, and there's reality. In between, there's this huge gap. Am I going to believe the best in you? Am I going to assume the worst in you? You get to pick. You get to pick what goes inside the gap. I can either assume the worst or believe the best. Oh, man, you know what? You overspent the budget again. There she went. She went and spent all that money again. All that money's gone. And before we know the story, we've already assumed the worst. The girl couldn't keep a budget if her life depended on it. He said that he was going to be home. You know what? I'll bet you anything. He stopped off and he's hanging out with the boys because he's not here right now. He's always irresponsible. Or you can say, you know what? Maybe the reason they're over budget is because they took the kids to BGMC this last week, Boys and Girls Missionary thing at Vacation Bible School. They're raising money for missions, and maybe they just felt compelled to give. Maybe he didn't stop off and hanging out with the boys, and he's irresponsible, whatever the kid. maybe there was a flat tire. Maybe there was an accident. Maybe he stopped to help somebody. You see, you get to pick what goes inside of that gap. Nope, late for supper again. You know what? Doesn't matter how many clocks, how many watches, they're always going to be late, always, always, always. Or maybe something came up that we don't know anything about. Now, that gap right there, there's two things. Two things determine what we put in the gap. Two things influence whether we believe the best or assume the worst. And the two things are this. Number one, the reality. The reality is the money's gone. They're not here. They didn't fulfill their promise. They didn't keep up their end of the bargain. I mean, that's the reality. The other thing that influences what we put inside of this gap is who you are. It's the person that you are, the person that you brought into the marriage. Because remember, last week we talked about every marriage, we bring baggage into the marriage. So who you are determines what you put in the gap. And a lot of who you are is based upon your upbringing and your background. It comes out of the home that you were in. Maybe you were in another relationship in high school and that person betrayed you and now you're suspicious of every relationship after that. Maybe you're just a suspicious person, period. So you're always assuming the worst in the person that you're married to because that's what somebody did to me in my past. This person's going to do it to me now. Maybe you're just a worrier, just a born worrier. The glass is always, always, always half empty. And so you just assume the worst all the time when you look at the other person. Maybe you experienced abandonment. Maybe you had an absent parent. Maybe you had an alcoholic parent, an addicted parent. I don't know what goes on in your home. And you bring that. And so now this is painting your perspective on your relationship today. You were betrayed. You were cheated somewhere along the line. And you assume that since it happened once, it's going to happen again. And I'm just telling you that your past experiences paint the attitude that you bring to your relationships, including your marriage. And let me just ask you this. Where do you want to go? When you look at that, where do you want to go? When something happens in any relationship, it could be with your parents, it could be with your children, it could be with your spouse, where do you want to go? Do you want to believe the best or do you want to assume the worst? Well, pastor, let me just tell you about the man I'm married to. I'll give you a slide to put up there, and it'll have a list all like, I'll just show you. She just throws her neck out there because, you throw your neck, you got something to say, right? Pastor, you come live with my spouse, I'll give you a slide. You'll have something to preach, Here's what I know. People who stay in love believe the best in each other. People who stay in love, they believe the best in the other person no matter the circumstances because they want to stay in love. You did this when you were dating. We've talked about this over the last couple of weeks. When you were dating that person, when they walked into the room, your heartbeat just sped up a little bit. You started to kind of just quicken the pulse, and you kind of got all flushed in the face, and he's here and she's here, and you're like, and they might have been making mistakes along the way, but you didn't care because you were in love with that person, and you were generous with explanations for their behavior to your friends. You just made all kinds of generous explanations for their behavior. But then what can happen after you get married, instead of giving a generous explanation, you start keeping a record 3 times last week, twice today, 4 times last night. And that happens in relationships. Here's what researchers have found. Researchers, you know who researchers are? They're really smart people that don't have a whole lot to do. But anyway, researchers kind of did this whole thing, and they said this: people who stay in love see qualities in the other person that the other person doesn't see in themselves. In other words, if you'd ask me about my wife, I'd say to you, my wife is extremely intelligent. She has this incredible discernment about situations and people. She's organized, she's witty, she's got a great sense of humor, she's phenomenal with people. And if you would talk to Robin, she might not believe any of that or think that about herself. If you talk to Robin, don't talk to Robin. Robin sees things in me that I don't see in myself. And you know what? All that proves is that love really is blind. That's all it proves. That we really believe things about the person that we're married to that they don't necessarily see in themselves. Now, when you're always, listen to me, when you're always assuming the worst in a relationship, when you're always assuming the worst in your spouse, when you're always assuming the worst in your children, mom and dad, listen to me. when you're always assuming the worst, you are undermining the health of that relationship. When you assume the worst, the other thing you need to know is not only are you undermining the health of that relationship, when you're assuming the worst in somebody, you're always right. You're always right. See, late again, I told you. See, overspent the budget again, told you. See, another fender bender, told you. See, missed curfew again, told you. You know why? You're always right because you're always looking for the wrong. And every time they do something wrong, you know it. You've assumed the worst in there. So, didn't text, wasn't home on time, didn't spend the money. See, I told you. And every time you assume the worst, you're always right, and you win every argument, and you lose every time. Every time. You assume the worst, here's what you don't understand. When you assume the worst, and I thought about this a little bit. I thought this applies not only to marriages, but I think the relationships with our kids too. When you assume the worst in someone all the time, you make them afraid of you. I mean, who wants to come home to that? Who wants to come home and you open the door, honey, I'm home. I mean, who wants to come home to that? And so you make this person afraid of you. And when they're afraid of you, they want to lie to you. They don't want to come home. You ever thought about that before? You're always right. Yep, you're right. And you prove them wrong every time. Boy, that makes somebody feel so good about themselves, doesn't it? Let me tell you something about the person that you're married to. Let me tell you something about the heart of your children. The heart of your children and the heart of your spouse never want to disappoint you. Nobody lays in bed at night next to their spouse going, I wonder when I wake up tomorrow how I can really just crush the hopes, dreams, and the heart of the person that I'm married to. Nobody ever does that. In fact, in a marriage situation, ladies, let me tell you this for just a moment. The one voice that is the loudest and the most powerful in your husband's life is yours. If you tell him to jump over this bar, he wants to jump over that bar. He'll meet whatever bar of expectation you are. The problem I think sometimes men have is like, where's the bar? She never told me where the bar is. It's right here. They never want to disappoint you. They don't want to do that. And when you assume the worst, in somebody, they'll disappoint you every single time. And you know what you communicate when you assume the worst? When you assume the worst, you're telling that person, you'll never be good enough. You communicate to that person that you love them based upon performance. Think about this with your children for a little bit. You want to know why your kids are lying to you all the time? Because the fear is if I let you down, you see, you're looking for the worst in me. You know, your spouse lies to you because you assume the worst in me. And I don't want to disappoint you. I want to tell you what you want to hear. So I'm going to lie to you. And then you discover the lie a little bit later, and you end up being married to the very person that you hate. You created the liar in that spouse. You create the liar in your child because they're thinking, if I say something that you don't want to hear, it's going to disappoint you, and you're not going to like me. And so all you communicate to them is, my relationship with you, because I assume the worst all the time, it's based upon performance. If you perform well, if you can jump high enough, if you can succeed well enough, if you can be good enough, I'll love you. But if you don't meet the expectation because I'm always assuming the worst, well, you'll just never be good enough. But when you believe the best, when you believe the best in somebody, when you believe the best in your kids, when you believe the best in your spouse, when you look for the best in them, you create this safe zone in the relationship. Yep, I messed up. Yep, I didn't come home on time. Yep, I didn't make the phone call. Yep, I went over the budget. Yep, I spent the money. Yep, I shouldn't have done that. Yep, I know that I messed up. But now there's a safe place to have a conversation instead of telling a lie, which then creates this sense of trust. And trust creates intimacy, and intimacy creates security. And isn't that what we all want in a relationship? But when you assume the worst, you create a person who's a liar, and you end up married to the person you hate. Let me tell you about your spouse's heart. Let me tell you about the heart of the person that you're married to. Let me tell you about the heart of your children, mom and dad. They want the same thing you do. acceptance. They just want to be accepted. Can you accept me even if I'm not perfect, if I don't measure up to your expectations? You let your spouse know that you will trust them until there's no other explanation. I will give you the benefit of the doubt until we have run out of any other options. When it becomes absolutely clear that there's no other explanation for your behavior, but up until then, I will believe you every time. Jesus kind of chimes in on this whole thing, but he says it so differently. And in fact, the way Jesus says it applies, I think, not just to marriage, but to all the relationships that we have in our life. Our friendships, our coworkers, our spouses, our family members. Jesus said it like this in Luke chapter 6. Read it with me. It's up on the screen. He says, look, you know these verses. He says, don't judge others, and you won't be judged. Now, listen. I think we've really kind of misused this whole, stop judging me. You ever hear that from somebody? Stop judging me. What does judge mean? I think sometimes people say, don't judge me because they're feeling guilty about something, and they don't want to feel guilt. But anyway, in this context, Jesus says, don't draw a conclusion about somebody until you have all the information. Have you ever done that? Have you ever looked at what somebody's wearing, what somebody's driving, how somebody's living, how somebody's spending, how somebody's speaking, and you drew a conclusion, but you never heard the whole story? Jesus says, don't do that. In your marriage, don't do that. Don't draw a conclusion about them until you know the whole story. Because if you do, they're going to look at you exactly the same way. In fact, he says, don't condemn others or it's going to come back against you. In other words, Jesus, I think if I could paraphrase Jesus here for a little bit, Jesus said, in essence, what comes around goes around. I think that's what Jesus is saying here. He goes on to say, forgive others, and then you'll be forgiven. Come on, raise your hand. How many love to be forgiven? Raise your hand. I love to be forgiven, right? And Jesus said, if you want that, you have to give it. And then the next thing that Jesus says, I've heard this verse preached when it comes to giving in the church. But I don't think this next verse even has anything to do with money. Because remember, Jesus is talking about how we relate to each other. Don't condemn, don't judge, offer forgiveness. And then look what he says in the very next verse, verse number 38. Put it on the screen. Give what? Give forgiveness. Give what? Give the benefit of the doubt. Give what? Give your belief in the best in the other person, and you'll receive that. He says, in fact, your gifts are going to return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. I don't think it has anything to do with money. I think it has everything to do with how we view other people. And if you want people to have a lavish love and a lavish grace and a lavish acceptance of you, Jesus says we need to be that way to other people. And when we are, it just floods our life. In fact, it fills it. He says in verse number 30 and 38, the rest of that, he says, look, the amount you give will determine the amount you get back. It's proportional. It's proportional. If you want to be stingy with grace, if you want to be stingy with forgiveness, if you want to be lavish with condemnation, if you want to give lots and lots of judgment, it all comes back to you in the same proportion. And then Jesus kind of, if he could summarize all of that, he's like, okay, if you don't get all of that, if you don't get the whole thing about judging, condemnation, and press down, shaking together, if you don't get that, just remember this one thing right here. Verse number 31. I'll just put it in one little verse. Verse number 31. Do to others as you would like them to do to you. You ever heard that before? I think it's called the green rule. I'm just seeing if you're listening. It's the golden rule. All right, anyway, okay. Just do to other people like you'd like to have them do to you. That's all you got to do. If you're always assuming the worst, let me ask you this. If you're always assuming the worst in the person that you're married to, always assuming the worst in your kids, always assuming the worst in your parents, how's that working for you? How's that working for you? What if we started believing the best? Do you realize that could revolutionize your relationship with the person that you're in love with? And here's what I know. Before you go to sleep tonight, because of human nature, before you go to sleep tonight, there's going to be the opportunity for a gap in your relationship. You've got an expectation. In fact, that maybe already went on this morning, There's an expectation. They haven't met the expectation. You get to pick what goes inside of the gap. Do I believe the best? Do I assume the worst? And this is why I just want to camp out on marriage for a little bit. Because nothing speaks so loud to the culture in which we live than a healthy marriage. You see, when a marriage is healthy, and it's loving, and it's exclusive, and it's all good, it represents a relationship that God wants to have with his people. Why do you think marriages and family come under such attack in our culture? Because if he can divide the family, he can impact the culture. I'm saying let's keep our love alive and keep it together. And when Jesus, if you don't get any of this, just think about it this way. When Jesus looks at you, and he looks at the way you lived from last Sunday after church until Sunday this week when church started again. When you look past over the 7 days, and your behavior and your language and your activity and your entertainment and all that kind of stuff, when Jesus looks at everything you did for the last week, how do you want Jesus to look at you? To believe the best in you or assume the worst in you? I know the answer to that question. That's why I ask it. And if that's the way we want Jesus to look at us, why wouldn't we want to look at our spouse that way? Why wouldn't we want to look at our children that way? Why wouldn't we want to look at people that way? Love is an action. It's not what we feel. It's how we treat people. It's what we do. It submits. It surrenders just like Jesus did for all of us here today. And I thought about this for a little bit. I thought maybe just to kind of finish up a little bit this morning, maybe what we should do is just think, are there apologies that we need to make? And is there forgiveness that we need to offer?